Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I wanted to give you some tips to help you get the most out of utilizing EQ while mixing. The first tip I have here is to use cuts more than boosts while EQing. And there are a few reasons that I like to use cuts more often than boosts. The first is related to headroom. In many genres of electronic music, you want to achieve a certain level of loudness in your mix. And to do this, it's very helpful to reduce the amount of headroom certain sounds take up. If you have a sound at a certain level and you enhance it by cutting certain frequency ranges rather than boosting other frequency ranges, you will probably reduce the headroom that sound is taking up without really changing the apparent volume of that sound. It still sounds as loud, it's just cleaner and clearer. Whereas if you're enhancing with boosts, you will more likely be increasing the amount of headroom that the sound uses. And the second reason I like to use cuts more often than boosts is that I found that enhancing my sounds with cuts more than boosts helps to really open up the mix and allow other sounds to come through better, without even really having to think about it as much. And this makes sense because instead of adding more frequency presence in the mix, you're reducing the frequencies present in the mix. And the final reason is due to how we perceive sound. You may have heard the phrase that louder sounds better. And this statement is very true. We tend to perceive the same song as sounding better when played back at a louder volume. And this applies to mixing as well. If you use a lot of boosts to enhance your sounds, you might be tricking yourself into thinking that you're improving them when in reality they only sound better because they are louder. You may even find that they actually sound worse when played back at the same perceived loudness in some cases, if you are using a bunch of boosts to try and make a sound better. And that's definitely not always the case, but it could be the case. Now, boosts are definitely an important part of the EQ process, and I don't mean to imply that they are bad to use. My only intention with this tip is to explain why I start with cuts and use them more often than boosts. My next tip here is don't overdo EQ. When you first start using EQ to clean up and enhance your sounds, it can be easy to overdo things. And usually the outcome of overdoing EQ, in my experience, is a stale, thin, cardboardy mix that kind of lacks heart and emotion. And this happens when you cut out too much of your low mids on non-bass sounds, or cutting too many frequencies in general, and maybe even boosting the high end too much. This is really something that you want to avoid, and this is why I advise beginners to focus more on using EQ to help each sound be heard well, and less on changing the character of individual sounds at first. Doing this may result in a mix that is a bit less bright and a little bit muddy, but I would much rather listen to a muddy mix than a cardboard mix. Once you have a bit more practice and are more familiar with how things should sound, and how things should sound on your monitors or headphones, you will be less likely to overuse EQ. And you don't have to take this advice, but you will always want to just be careful and really pay attention while you EQ, just to make sure you're not overdoing anything. And using a reference track and really listening closely to your EQ adjustments and comparing them to that reference track can be very helpful in avoiding poor use of EQ. And my next tip here is to use a reference track. I just said that using a reference track is a great idea, and it really, really is. If you really pay attention to the character of the different sounds in your reference track and try to recreate that character on your sounds using EQ, it can really help you to get the final results in your mix that you want. Now, you always do want to make sure to pay attention to how those sounds sound in your mix as well, playing together, because that is very important. But, using a reference track can help you get the frequency balance of different sounds to be pretty good, pretty accurate, and pretty much how you want them to be. So I talked about reference tracks in part 1 of this tutorial, but they're definitely helpful guides through all aspects of mixing for a beginner. If you need a guide or don't feel confident in your mixing judgment, check what you're doing against your reference. As you get used to the process of mixing, you'll trust your monitors, headphones, and ears much more and probably pull away from reference mixing. But reference mixing can be incredibly helpful for beginners or even experienced producers who are mixing on, a new or unfamiliar set of monitors or headphones. And this may be the last time that I will mention reference mixing throughout this tutorial, but keep it in mind throughout the rest of the tutorial. And if you don't know what I'm talking about with reference mixing, I go in depth about it in part 1. Now, my next tip here is that you don't always need to EQ every sound. It is true that I will have an EQ on most, if not all, my sounds in a mix. But there are times when I will have a certain sound that doesn't need any EQ. This is somewhat rare, but it is important to know not to EQ simply for the sake of EQing. If you don't hear anything about a sound that you want to change, don't pressure yourself into changing it with EQ. Only use EQ when you know what you want to achieve by using it. If you want to brighten up a lead, if you want to reduce some bass frequencies in your non-bass sounds, if you want to clean up a sound by making a cut or enhance that sound by making a boost, or if you just want to clear room for another sound by cutting on a certain sound. In these cases, definitely use an EQ. But if you really don't have anything in mind that you want to change about a sound with EQ, there's no reason to pressure yourself into doing it. And how much you actually need to use EQ will greatly depend on the sounds you use and the style of music you make. If you download a really nice pack of already processed professional sounding kick drums for house music, you may not need to EQ that kick at all for it to sound right, and then you just kind of mix around that kick. But the whole point of this tip is to just don't pressure yourself into using an EQ if you really don't feel like you need to. Because, some people might think, oh, I need to EQ every sound or else my mix is bad, and really that's not the case. Now, my next tip here is to focus on the full mix. When you EQ your sounds, it's important to pay attention to how each sound will fit in the mix. Sometimes you may have a lot of sounds that sound amazing on their own, but when they play together, the mix sounds muddy or confused. If you pay attention to the role that each sound plays in your mix while you EQ to clean and enhance them, you can avoid running into this problem. This is especially the case for sounds that never play solo. So if you have a clap, for example, that only plays when your kick plays, like in house music a lot, or if you have a lead sound in a hardstyle track that only plays when the kick plays, it doesn't really matter how those sounds sound on their own, because they're only playing when other sounds also play. And so, you would EQ that clap to make sure that it plays well with the kick, and you would also EQ that lead to make sure it plays well with that hardstyle kick. So for that lead, it might end up sounding a little bit thin if it were to play on its own, but since it's only playing with the kick, it doesn't really matter, as long as it sounds good when it plays with that kick. So for sounds that never play on their own, you can EQ them purely based on how they sound in the mix. Now, my next tip here is to compare your equalized sound with your raw original sound to make sure that you are actually improving the sound. And so if your EQ has a bypass option, you would do that. Or if you can just bypass specific effects in your mixer, you can use that. And you just want to compare your original sound with that EQ sound by turning that EQ on and off, or turning your EQ changes on and off. and really make sure that you have made the sound better. Because if you spend too much time EQing, you can kind of get lost in the process, especially if you're newer to the mixing process. And using that bypass, turning that EQ off and listening to the EQ'd sound and the original sound will really help you make sure that you are improving the sound. And my next tip here is to be wary of online EQ tips. There are tons of articles and videos about mixing out there, and many of them can be very helpful or just inspire new approaches and techniques. However, you want to take all advice as just advice and not rules, and also pay attention to the context. I've found that the majority of the top search results for mixing are in the context of acoustic recordings. And mixing acoustic music is quite different from mixing electronic music. The very basic idea is the same, but when you get into specific advice, the differences become more apparent. And a good example of this is the common advice to avoid cutting or boosting by more than roughly 3 decibels. As I mentioned before, you don't want to overdo your EQ. But this advice really originates from the idea of keeping your sounds sounding natural. So when you're mixing an acoustic song, you're working with recordings of real instruments that have a certain character in the real world. So slight EQ adjustments will keep your instrument sounding natural and real to the listener. But if you're cutting or boosting too much, it will very likely result in an unnatural sound that won't be very appealing. And this will cause the listener to be more aware that they are listening to a recording because of that unnatural character. However, in electronic music, we work with a lot of sounds that are completely synthetic and have no real-world counterpart. And we might work entirely with these sounds and use no real recordings of real instruments. So, nothing sounds natural to begin with in the songs. So larger boosts and cuts are much more acceptable and can even be necessary more often than in acoustic music. You do still just want to make sure that you're not overdoing it and really listen to it and really pay close attention to what you're doing and how it changes the sounds. Now, my final tip here is really more of a note. And this is that EQ can affect the phases of different frequencies in your sound. I really didn't want to include this in this part of the tutorial, but I just didn't feel quite right not at least mentioning it. The EQ plugins you use for mixing can change the phases of your various frequencies at least slightly. I've found that this happens more when using large boosts or really steep high-pass filters. And in my experience, this rarely causes a problem, and I strongly encourage you to push this knowledge to the back of your mind for now. I will be going into depth about phase in a later part of this tutorial. When you have more experience, this information will be more relevant to you, and you will know when EQing causes phase changes that you do not want in your mix, as well as how to avoid them. But seriously, don't worry about this for now, and focus on the basics. Focus on cleaning up and enhancing your sounds, and giving each sound its own space in the mix, using EQ.